let me introduce the authors to you first. Professor Hugo Gorringe holds the position of professor and is head of sociology at the University of Edinburgh. He is also the former co-director of the Centre for South Asian Studies at the University of Edinburgh as well. And his research in India is centered on the social-political mobilization of Dalits and their ongoing quest for equality, which plays a pivotal role in the deepening of Indian democracy. Hugo has recently co-edited the book Caste in Everyday Life, Experience and Affect in Indian Society, together with Dhaneswar Bhoi, who I'll introduce in a moment. And some of Hugo's most recent work is Panthers in Parliament, Dalits, Caste and Political Power in South India by Oxford University Press in 2017, and Untouchable Citizens, Dalit Movements and Democratization in Tamil Nadu, Sage 2005. He has also made a number of contributions to publications such as Civility in Crisis, Democracy, Equality, and the Majoritarian Challenge in India, Routledge in 2021, and From the Margins to the Mainstream, Institutionalizing Minorities in South Asia, Sage 2016. So that's only a flavor of what Hugo has done. Dhaneswar Bhoi holds the title of Honorary Fellow at the University of Edinburgh and is engaged as a lecturer in social psychology and module leader at the London School of Science and Technology, an institution affiliated with the University of West London in the UK. He has a postdoctorate from the Centre for South Asian Studies at the University of Edinburgh, and he's also pursued courses in other equality and diversity fields. His academic impact extends beyond research, as evidenced by his roles as an associate editor for the Journal of the World Universities Forum and a reviewer for prestigious journals such as Politics, Groups, and Identities, published by Routledge and many others. This is also being held under the auspices of the Race Matters Initiative, which I started in 2020 with a colleague of mine following the death of George Floyd. And this is a space for us to talk about issues about race and ethnicity and indigeneity and caste outside of the curriculum that is offered for students. So thank you very much and welcome. I'll call upon Hugo first to set the scene to explain the kind of concepts on the book. And Dhaneswar would then follow on to talk about the structure of the book and his contribution. And then I would spend 5 minutes just asking some questions and then open it up to the floor. So we hope to have about half an hour for questions from the discussion. So without further ado, Hugo.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that kind introduction, and apologies not to be there in person. I mean, it's great that we have this technology, but it is so much better meeting face to face. So hopefully we get the chance to do that in future. Thanks also to Dhaneswar for getting this organized, and to the LSE's Social Policy Race Initiative and the Ambedkar Society for this opportunity to talk about our work. So I've been tasked with setting out the conceptual and theoretical framework of the volume, and then Dhaneswar is going to talk more about the contents. And it's great to see some of the contributors online. Hope they don't get too bored from this talk, and hope they put us straight if we misrepresent their work in any way. So I'm going to share some slides now. Can you see those okay?
Yeah.
Perfect. So start from the point that caste, as we know, is a structure of inequality that shapes people's lives and life chances across the Indian subcontinent, most closely associated with India, but present in various forms in all countries of South Asia. And it's been analyzed in a range of different ways. What we thought we would do in this volume is to focus on the day-to-day experiences and the structures of affect which govern how it's manifested on a day-to-day basis. Our inspiration for this, the starting point is Ambedkar's assertion that castes exist only in the plural number. There's no such thing as a caste. There are always castes. Caste, in other words, has to be studied relationally. You have to look at the interactions and interplays between different individuals, groups, in order to understand how it works. What this means is that castes and caste orders, in the plural, are created, shaped, and reproduced through action and interaction. They're not given or static, but emerge, adapt to, and evolve in particular times and contexts. To fully understand how and why caste persists, thus, requires us to pay attention to the everyday manifestations and dynamics, and that's what we try and do. What this entails is a rejection of text-based understanding, such as offered by Dumont, which present caste as an unchanging and ideologically consistent hierarchy. That's not to say that we throw the texts out altogether. They're important as a framework for understanding it, but they don't help to understand how and why caste takes the shape it does in particular times. In some ways as well, we're inspired by the work of Michael Billig on nationalism, who draws a distinction between what he calls hot nationalism and banal nationalism. What we contend is that the banal, everyday, unremarked, unnoticed manifestations of caste are what explain the eruptions of caste hatred and violence that we see from time to time. So the volume also departs from so-called ethno-sociological accounts proposed by scholars like Malcolm Marriott and Ronald Inden, which claim to offer an emic perspective on caste. They focus on coded substances, as you can see in the quote in the box on the right-hand side, which may be incorporated and passed on. Persons, they argue, may preserve their particular composite natures and powers by stabilizing their constituents and by admitting into themselves only what is homogeneous and compatible, i.e., the choices that people make about what to eat, who to engage with, who to marry, shapes who they are as a person. Their work argues that people seek to acquire the most appropriate substances for themselves through right eating, right marriage, and other right exchanges and actions. We agree that each of these actions are vitally important, but rather than focusing in on the substances which are transmitted, rather than seeing the substances as transmitting any essences, we place an emphasis on the transactions and interactions between groups and individuals. Ethno-sociological accounts, as several commentators note, neglect power, class, and politics, and end up portraying caste almost as an inherent substance, something that people have rather than something that they do. Marriott's own data, we argue, contradicts this when noting that higher caste persons refuse both cooked and uncooked food from a sweeper. That makes sense. They're trying to protect their substances, but they accept grain, which was actually harvested or threshed by a sweeper, if he works as an employee under a landowner or a caste higher in rank. As Marriott argues, here it's not the substance or the sweeper's touch, but his rank in the transaction which matters. This being the case, how can you argue that substances create rank? So we follow Ambedkar in highlighting the processual and relational basis rather than essence of caste. We are also inspired by the path-breaking work of Guru and Sarukai in Experience Caste and the Everyday Social. In this work, they note that individuals make meaning of the social not only from being taught about socialization, for example, but also from experiencing it. Caste is not only in the mind, despite Ambedkar's characterization of it as a notional identity, caste is not only in the mind since it appears through the ways we see, touch, smell, taste, and hear. Each of these modes becomes representative of caste. They become markers and signifiers of caste. The example they give, the classic one, is of greeting people by folding hands, which is politely to express unwillingness to touch the other. A point made very powerfully at the Round Table Conference in London in the 1930s by Redamala Srinivasan, Dalit activist from South India, from Tamil Nadu, who refused to shake hands with the monarch, saying, I am seen as untouchable. You know, why should I be the only one who gets to shake hands with the powers that be? Shaking hands, as that example shows so powerfully, is already performing a social act, one that's driven not only by social conventions, but reinforces how the social is touchable or untouchable in various ways. Such practices draw from and constitute what Narayan calls a performative code of conduct. And this is the final sort of tributary of the volume. This is something to which we're indebted to one of the reviewers of the book, who pointed us towards the work of Vivek Narayan, who draws on performance studies to offer an analysis of caste. And in doing so, he differentiates between what he terms caste codes and caste scripts. Caste codes seek to order interaction in ways that makes castes legible and, ultimately, governable. They offer rules of right conduct, precepts, prescriptions, proscriptions, so what you can and can't do, and examples of correct usage. Caste codes are typically Brahminical in origin and tend to assert caste. The interaction between performative codes of conduct, materiality, and social behavior is what he refers to as caste scripts. These exist in the real world and are typically the lived experience of caste inequity and the forms of governance that makes this possible. Hence, the picture there of the caste-coded village taken from an anthropological study. These scripts characterize the assumptions, judgments, substances, and practices that encast human experience and social meaning, that create meaning out of things rather than assuming that the meaning inheres within given substances. The example that Narayan uses is of the Malayali activist Ayangale, who famously rode through a market town, clothed in white and on a bullock cart, a form of attire and mode of transport hitherto reserved for upper castes. So in going down the high street in this attire, he challenged all the conventions of caste. What this highlights is that whilst the codes prohibited him from acting in a certain way, he was able to change the script. Caste, in other words, is not given, it is performed and reperformed in specific contexts. And this points to the issues raised in the volume of how caste is created and recreated in different contexts. Whilst the lens of performance is helpful, we follow Guru and Sarukai in stressing experience as well as performance. Caste, as Professor Joel Lee notes, operates according to an affective register in terms of deep-seated emotions and feelings. I vividly recall interviewing Dalit activists who said that they struggled to overcome feelings of disgust that they attached to those below them in the caste hierarchy, even though they were engaged in anti-caste struggles. Take also an example here from my field work. You know, a Dalit lady born and brought up in the more permissive environments of urban India, who's taken to the village of a workmate and suddenly confronted with a completely different scenario. You know, so she says, I'm sitting there with my friend, and you know, somebody comes begging for food. Who's that? oh, that's Payechi, a demeaning and disrespectful term for a person of the pariah caste. The person sitting on the bed, my respondent, is also from the same caste. Just like that, here I am sitting up on the bed being served food on a plate. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. And my friend looked at me and put her finger to her lips. That's how it is in the village. They'll come and beg for food and won't be given respect. It is these visceral feelings of humiliation, the sort of confusion occasioned by experiencing caste in a different context that flags up the significance of the affective registers of caste. Caste codes here are localized, leading to uncertainty, disorientation, and confusion. Caste hierarchies, as numerous studies have shown, are eroding, but the hierarchical values that underpin them remain and can serve to put people in their place and humiliate them. Calling Dalit students out to receive scholarships, branding certain foods as ramen and hence pure, viewing certain dietary practices as the norm, as in that wonderful little poem on the bottom right there, all serve to locate caste. And this matters significantly, as the experimental work by Hoff and Pandey shows, because they run tests for groups of students, and in simple problem-solving exercises, they find that people perform pretty much similarly to each other. Some Dalit participants may even outperform others until the caste of the participants is revealed, until people's social identities, locations, and labels are revealed for all to see, at which point the performance of the Dalit participants plummets significantly. So, it's not the fact of difference, it is the performance, the making salience of difference that matters here. Likewise, another one of my respondents spoke about the way in which everyday friendships could obscure and yet rest on the everyday silencing of caste. At college, he notes, I experienced subtle forms of caste feeling. It was a largely Deva, rather a sort of a backward but dominant caste at the village level. It was a largely Deva college. When I got called forward to receive my scholarship, it affected how some of them saw me. After that, some of them would refuse to share cigarettes. They talked about yetchi, about saliva, so, it's not about you, it's about, hygiene, but they drag on others' cigarettes. I had no need of such friends. Some while later, I met up with this guy, a group of us were drinking, and he picked up my glass and finished off the drink. Does yetchi matter less when you're drinking? I asked him, and he got all tense. Friendships here, as in many places, rest on tacit avoidances, silences, and rules of engagement that can be fraught at times. Caste, as here, is increasingly and assertively questioned and challenged, but it persists due to these casted enactments and performances, as well as larger scale associations, institutions, and, the economics of caste. In this volume, therefore, we eschew structural analyses, although recognizing their importance, for an experiential and everyday understanding of caste. For an overview of the contributions of the volume, for detail of the experiences of caste, I hand over to my co-editor of the volume, which you can see up there, who is Dr. Dhaneswar Bhoi. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm Dr. Dhaneswar Bhoi. I'm a Dalit. Being a Dalit, I'm proud. Breaking all the barriers of caste, all the boundaries of caste, I have reached here. I'm very proud that in this place, Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar, who studied and who became inspiration and milestone for many. So my story begins a Dalit who denied to have the water in the neighborhood on the basis of caste. who was beaten in a public ceremony of marriage where the commensurnality was a problem, where interdining was a problem. So I start my journey with the dedication of the book, which I dedicate this book to my mother and my younger brother, who obviously fought for the caste, and they are no more now. But the incidents where me and my younger brothers and fellow Dalit community were gathered, and we're trying to have food with the Brahmins or other social dominant caste groups, but were vehemently beaten up, and as a result, we boycott the event. But my mother said, if you are serving to this group, it will not end, and you need to prove yourself through education. So I think education makes a pathway for me, and Ambedkar became an inspiration. And there are many fellows who helped me a lot, especially in Hugo and many other teachers. I'm thankful to Dr. Sunil, Ritu, and the entire audience, and for my colleagues, especially Floyd. So this center even started with a story of how they organized lecture through the death of Floyd. But I'm starting this book discussion sessions. So we have basically 5 major sections in this book. First one, introductions. We theorize how caste operates in the everyday life, and what are the experiences and the effects within the transaction of caste. So we refer Gopal Guru and Sundar Sarukai, Swelli, and Vivek Naran, and many others to theorize this work. The first sections deal with psychosocial violence. So in this section, we have 2 papers. One is talking about how psychosocial violence created intentionally, perpetuated. So in this section, Professor Paul argued that the everyday slur, everyday bullying towards the Dalit create an atmosphere where the Dalit get bullied, and the dominant caste, the upper caste, they provoke some group of Dalit to create conflict. If we talk about the case of Lathor, where more than 50 Dalit households were born with the violent activity of upper caste. If you see the Hathras gang rape case, and if you see the Kerala massacre, where entire Dalit family were murdered by the dominant caste, how it separates. So in this context, Paul argues it is a systematic, perpetuated violence, which is prevailing in the society, and David Edmond called it is a caste war. So in the name of the caste, people provoke how they can create conflict and spread the conflict. Then the second chapter, where myself contributed the work, how caste is obvious in university space, taking the work of how caste is performative, how caste is performed through a code. So when the Dalit enter to the university, the first barrier is the entrance point, where they have a very less space to enter. Once they entered into the university space, again, there are channels of caste discrimination going on, starting from living space to access the resource of library, access the resource of the university building, access the university playground, or any resource where the caste are as a code. So if you are from privileged caste, then your entry is very smooth. And when you are from Dalit, then your entry is restricted. So in this work, So we just theorized how caste perform through self-harm or when there is a perpetuated, there is an intentional bias, there is a caste discrimination, which is perpetuated through different modes, starting from resource access, living space access, and the performance. Basically, there are intentional mark in Bhaiva as well as in written exams, and even their performance in debate, GK, even political performance or political participation is also coded through caste. So which resulted Dalit suicide. If you see the Rohit Vemula's suicide, so when I was in India in 2016, so this was a press incident where many Dalit agitated against this event. Even government was very engaging in this process to stop this agitation. And finally, the government closed this issue now, but Rohit did not get any justice. And there are many Rohits who died through this caste, similar to Floyd. And the next chapter, where Subhadarshi and this can argue the caste not only present in university setting, but also school. It is very much existing through midday meal, skill serving, access the books, through engaging the students in cleaning toilets and all. And the next work is based on caste, stigma, and subject formation. These are three very interesting subjects where chapter from Kumar. He is a professor in Delhi University. So he just trying to narrate a concept called how caste and stigma formatted. So he's just quoting his grandfather was Dalit and he was identified as Dalit servant in a village. So to display his identity, so there was a stick, wooden stick, and there was an iron bell attached to his identity to point out that Dalit is from. So he just get aside or just away from that Dalit. So this is a signifying story. Even if the story not ends here, even if when professor in Delhi University, but still he is treated as Dalit professor. He is a professor. But he wonderfully conceptualized how the stigma formatted. Then the second chapter in this section, Shailaja Menon, who works on Ulvao's the performative art, where the Dalits were performing the role of Nek, where they used to sing songs and dance for the betterment of the life. But in this case, so the concept of superiority makes them work, even they get less paid or they considered as the duty of the caste. So in this case, Shailaja had wonderfully narrated. So the children from this Dalit caste, they drop out from their school because they have to support their parents in this performative art, which is basically a art which is given by the society, and it also not helping them very positively. The art which is appropriating culture, which makes an inferior complex or inferior social position, even the marginalized, but they are trying to be attend some position through this dance. Then Indra Sivaramani, she argues how caste operates in Tamil Nadu, despite of legislation and legal codes that temple space should be space for everybody, but it is still not allowing Dalits to enter into the temple, so still it is blocked by the caste norm and codes. Coming to the next, which is banal casteism, everyday superiority, how superiority formed in a societal context. If you talk about the works of Gorringe Kumar and Amrita Mohan Kumar, they are just talking about the branding of Brahmin food. The Brahmin food is considered to be authentic food, superior food, and it was branded a superior hegemony, which is perpetuated superior versus inferior, and through digital platform, through YouTube, through website, through advertisement, they are just creating a notion of purity versus pollution, and the concept of Brahmin and the higher caste to be placed at superior position through this chapter. Then Ankita Bhatkande argues like how the language became a major link for discriminating others. If you are not talking Shuddh Marathi in Maharashtra, then you will be considered as a lower caste or do not talk like others. So do not talk like others means you are, if you are deviating slightly from the Shuddh Marathi or pure Marathi, then you will be considered as lower caste. So this is the experience from Brahmin perspective. Why this book is very important, because this is not only capturing the experience of Dalit, but it also captures the experiences of Brahmin, how they admire, how they accept that they are doing injustice. Then the chapter from Disha, in this concept, it talks about that cross-caste romance, even if Dalit get attached to some higher caste through romance or love and they marry, but their later life is also not caste-free. Their family are not accepting, their family creating many problems which ruin their life, which normalize their life to a different thing. So the next is economies of caste. So covering all the aspects, we move to economies of caste. So we talk about how caste is in urban space or urban periphery. So there are two papers. One is Vairaj Visalwadi and second one is Nilimar Lakra. So in this concept, we got that how Dalit experience urban lives. So with the expectation of having a better life when he arrived, but practically the work that Dalit doing it urban space, that was considered to be dirty, and that dignity is hampering in urban space. Sometimes direct and indirect discrimination makes more vulnerable to their life. And similarly, in the caste, labor, and migration, when Dalit migrated to city with the hope of better life, because he was completely suffocated in the village caste structure, and with the hope of to get some earning and have a better life, when he arrived at urban periphery, again there is a giant caste structure is available, which ruin the life of Dalit even worse than the village. And when they engage in brick-clean activities, the work and cultural activities is also performed through caste code. And this work is beautifully concluded by Professor Surinder Jotka. So he concluded how caste is a system of everyday social. So it starts the caste starting from how the power dynamics available in the caste and how the caste passed on different phases of society and the debates of political argument, how the Mandal Commission came, and later on if you discuss the caste everydayness, it's not ended from one point, starting from birth to death. It is visible and it is very much present. So if we want to conclude, caste is a pathway and life supporting network for some, and it is a life supporting network for others when it comes to Dalits. So I think I'll end my talk here, and we'll have more questions and comments from Dr. Sunil. Thank you.
Thank you, Hugo and Dhaneswar. I'm just going to just kick off with a few questions and then take questions from the floor because we've got a lot of time, as well as, do we take questions from the?
I don't think there are any.
Okay. Right. I just wanted to push a little bit on the issue of affect.
Yeah.
Affect is becoming something that is being talked about in policy terms and in social policy. The idea of anger, the idea of disgust, the idea of, feeling threatened, those kind of emotional feelings which are kind of suppressed in this technocratic, bureaucratic policy making space. And I wanted to push a little bit on what forms that took in this work. I know the book came out from a workshop and it's 2 years in the making. And I also wanted to know, in the 2 chapters that talk about the lived experience of the upper caste, the chapter on Brahmins' touch in digital branding, food, taste and identity by Gorringe Kumar and Ambedkar Kumar, and do not talk like other castes, language and everyday casteism in the Marathi Brahmin puzzle in Mumbai, and how different caste groups express or feel or negotiate or share this idea of affect. That I think is quite an interesting concept in your book, and I'm not sure it came out sufficiently in the introduction.
Do you want to respond? Hugo?
Sure, thank you. Great question. And I mean, as with any edited collection, there are so many angles that we could have pushed further. But I think you're right to highlight the 2 chapters that you did. But I would like to bypass them slightly and return to them in a minute and foreground. One of the chapters that brings out the structures of effect most clearly is by K.R. Disha on intercaste relationships. And so what they study are anti-caste activists who marry across caste, and how caste is then negotiated, managed, and either suppressed or tackled at the day-to-day level. And what you see here are the ways in which how people are silenced, how they are treated, how they are made to feel, how they are presented to others, shapes not only how they are viewed by the wider group, but how they themselves feel about themselves, their own degrees of subjectivity. In the 2 articles, the 2 chapters you mentioned, that on digital branding, it foregrounds, it goes back to that the hoary issue of caste, which is food, and they note how in contemporary capitalist society, caste increasingly functions as a selling point. And here, Brahmin is taken to index purity, is taken to index, wholesome food and something you can trust. What it builds on is that sense of, what Ambedkar referred to as the ascending scale of reverence, this sense of looking up to the Brahmin tag and following on from that. And it rests and manipulates that feeling to great commercial effect. In terms of do not talk like other castes, you see there the fact that, so how do different castes experience and share these issues of affect? Well, often they don't share them. They approach similar occasions and issues in very different ways. So here, children are scolded for, quotes, talking in the way that other castes do. They are reprimanded for deviating from the classical forms of speech, and in so doing are schooled to look down upon, to demean and to disregard those who speak in, quotes, lesser forms. And I'm reminded many years ago now, I was speaking at an event organized by members of the Vidudalai Sirtayal Kachi, the VCK, led by Toldev Mahavallavan. And I got there, and it was an IT meeting, so I was expecting loads of professionals, but instead you had a classic VCK audience. So I ended up doing much of the talking in Tamil, and at the end I apologized and said, look, I'm sorry, you've just got Tamil, you haven't got Sen Tamil, the pure Tamil, because I learned Tamil by interacting with people rather than through a book. And Thirumavalavan stood up and he said, I need to correct you on one thing. You're not speaking Kocha Tamil, you're speaking Makkal Tamil, the Tamil of the people, not a lesser form of Tamil. And in actions like that, seeking to revalorize how we view the way in which everyday people speak. And that stayed with me, and speaks to the way in which language, comportment, speech are loaded, are encasted in Narayan's phrase. So, I could go on, but Dhaneswar, do you want to come in at that point?
Yeah, thank you, Hugo. Thank you, Sunil. So, a very wonderful question. So, coming to your question of affect. So, when we just theorize the work, connecting the work of these words visually, so what operates, if we talk about experience and affects, mind versus actions, which comes first coming mind or in actions. If you connect the work of Professor Gopal Guru and Sundar Sarukai, they have beautifully narrated how caste form. And one of his important works, Sidhu, the concept of Sidhu, which is used against Dalit. That is a perception. So when Dalit are bullied in terms of not physically, in terms of a psychological sphere through a perception, and when Dalits are in the university, it is supposed to be treated Dalits are non-meritorious. Dalits are reserved category students. They don't have talent. They are come through the reservation policy, and they are Sidhu. The scheduled caste is Sidhu. So this psychological term, how it operates in a university space, that is basically, if you talk about the works of myself when I work for psychosocial experiences, and here I want that social experiences is from through the emotional experiences. When the Dalit get bullied, when the Dalit get discriminated, when the Dalit get less mark, when the Dalit denied to participate in any political or curricular activity, what is his mind state? And the mind state, the affect, the emotion, the affective mechanism which is perpetuated, which is organized by the vocal, each turning into the Dalit suicide. So maybe the needs to correct all chapter into emotion domain or emotion debates, but there are very important aspect of the psycho-emotional knowledge of Paul. Then Professor Hugo also rightly mentioned these as well, where how intercaste marriage is a big challenge. So what are the psychological, what are the emotional thing that one way you are very fascinated towards your partner, and both are ambitious. You met some places, and you both are radical and anti-caste activity. But what is your personal space in family level? How can we accept? So what are the psychological norm or psychological norm as in that space? And definitely there are works how Dalit victimized in urban space. What was his hope? If we are talking about that, when we consider hope, so I aspire that I'll have a better living and I have a better lifestyle in urban space. But what is the ultimate result? So you have more victimized in urban space. So that hope and aspiration is lost through the social norms or the caste code.
I asked that question also because I come from mixed heritage, I'm half Tamil, half Punjabi, and language becomes an issue in that space in the kind of 1950s and 60s. And I wondered also whether there's something to draw from interracial literature on interreligious marriages. I'm also kind of supervising an undergraduate student, third year undergraduate students who is from the traveling community. And how if you don't do things like the traveling community, you get ostracized from the traveling community, but then you're never ever in the mainstream, even if you stop traveling, right? So her dissertation is called In Between Two Worlds. I think I just picked that up on that. I have one more question and then I'll open it up to the floor. And that was to do with this idea of caste codes and caste scripts. And I think that's quite interesting because it suggests to me that this idea of caste becomes malleable. And in that malleability, it kind of takes greater root, if you like. And I'm just trying to read into what that might be. So you can always, I know it's not that code. So the idea of the etche, for example, how etche, which is saliva, is part of how in South India we drink water. We don't drink water by putting our lips to the glass, but by tilting it. So I can have a whole bottle of water without stopping. But that idea of etche then doesn't transmit to cigarette smoking or having a drink and so on. So I think those scripts are interesting. And I wondered if in your experience, and Ritu, you can also come in here, whether this idea of these scripts become, openings to kind of argue away caste discrimination, caste oppression. So it's things like that interview that you did. No, you're my friend and you might be a Dalit, but in the village, this is how it works. And therefore we have to treat Dalits in that village in that way. So that script allows you to be in two different worlds, if you like, at the same time.
Sure, that's a great question. A quick nod to the stuff you were saying earlier, and yes, I mean, drawing on a wider range of such experiences is important. I'm minded of W.E.B. Du Bois's work on the psychological wage of race, and actually what we see in some of the volume here is the way in which the upper castes have this psychological wage of caste. So all things being even, they are placed on a pedestal above others.
Psychological wage, I'm not sure you'll understand the concept. But W. Du Bois was talking about psychological wage, and he said that between blacks and whites in the United States, they were actually suffering the same forms of discrimination and oppression and so on and so forth. But the whites were made to feel that much superior, not by actually paying them more, but by treating them better and so on and so forth. And you get that, I mean, we talked to taxi drivers here before these, even now I think with Uber and so on and so forth, how rides are allocated to different people, depending on where you are in that race hierarchy or something of that nature. So the idea of the psychological wage is make the whites feel psychologically superior, even though they were not treated in that way. So I thought I'd come in there to explain that concept.
No, thank you. Yes, yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, you see that playing out in the chapter by Neelima Lakra, where she's talking about, workers in a brick kiln. I mean, ostensibly, they're both workers. They share the same objective conditions. They have the same interests, but they're divided along lines of caste because some see themselves as higher than others, and then this translates into the roles that they perform in the same work setting. In terms of caste codes and scripts, yeah, I mean, the suggestion that this allows one to argue away caste is interesting, and I think you're spot on. It does. You have what Suryakant Wagmore talks about. The increased practice of quotes politeness in everyday conversation, which allows you to continue reproducing caste, but it does also open up the possibility to challenge caste. So it does both. And as you say, I mean, it speaks to the malleability of caste. It speaks to this is why, the Dumontian understanding of caste doesn't work in every context, because it changes in different areas, it changes in different places, and caste has never been impermeable to political influence. So people have been able to change the script and then change their story to match the code. So yes, it absolutely points to that.
In my view, so when a caste code operates, so when we code something, like if you see the QR code, so technically, so before preparing that QR code or something to access something, so caste is also similar manner coded through text and through some of the norm and practice. So the lists were not supposed to have similar glass in a tea shop, like if you go to the village of tea. So for the Dalits, have a different glass where they can have the tea, but for another glass. But I'll just give one of my examples. When I was studying, so one of my teacher was from Ambedkar, but we have some transactional relation with that Ambedkar because we are serving them as a slave or something like servant to them. So my grandfather and father, they used to serve in their home. They are plowing their land or something. So to make our relation transactional, they make that there is a relationship of a religious friend or like Dharam Bandhu, like godfather kind of things. They are not blood or social relation, but to perform that functional relation, transactional relation that will serve to them, and they will give some money or some rice or something. In that case, so my grandfather asked that my grandchild should learn or study. When I used to go to their home, they used to give me some food, but they'll give me in a separate plate. And they'll ask me, I have to have that food in a separate place, not in the main building. Then I'll wash them, not in the main tap. I'll wash them in maybe canal or some other pond waters. Then I'll clean, then I'll place it. But our relation was very, very good in terms of transactional. So we don't have any emotional things, but we are related to traditional way where we are having them. They're giving something to us and we're having something. In this concept, this is my life experience, which I want to just relate how code forms. So to do this sort of work, in one way, we are like related each other. In another way, we segregate in different terms of how we can eat, how we can study. Even if that teacher from a program, he used to taught me and used to give me all these formulas, mathematics, everything, but still there is a barrier, and that is coded due to that.
How did you feel? Because you said you had a good relationship.
Good relation in the term of transaction.
Yes, but
Yeah.
you had a very kind of oppressive, kind of.
But when it is coming to commonality as a community, like that, they will not allow us. But they will give some money because they are not giving free. But we are serving, like we are just plowing their land, we are serving, we are cleaning their heterosexual, and all those things. In that term, they just make a nominal relationship. That is not real relation. That is like we will consider them that relatives, but they are had well.
Let's open it up.
I don't know how it's related, but I just try to bargain with the Pope.
Yeah, please.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for providing me this opportunity to ask this question. First of all, good evening, everybody. My name is Sunil Khan, and I'm a lecturer in higher education. And I would like to applaud all the discussion that's been happening. My interest is social psychology, and I would like to ask a question that how do you relate everyday psychology to caste discrimination? So that is my question from the presenters.
Hugo, do you want to respond this question?
Sure. Yeah. No, I want to. It's a great question. I'm not a social psychologist, but I have done a little bit of work with colleagues around this, and the idea that comes to mind is that of the elaborated social identity model, and we can think about this in different ways. So, in terms of the day-to-day individual psychology, this is very much context dependent, and it's shaped by your social identity. So you can't abstract the individual from the collective, and that's what Hoff and Pandey's studies, the experiments where when caste is made salient, Dalits perform less well, illustrate so clearly, and what those models of identity suggest is that these are deep-rooted feelings that shape how you see yourself, how you act in the wider world, and how you interact with others. And so, that is why these structures of effect are so central to the analysis of the volume. So, everyday psychology is a sort of banal manifestation of caste, that looking down on people, seeing yourself as superior, viewing others with disgust is the day-to-day form, which may not have an impact, but can find expression in violent ways, as some of the chapters shows, in exclusive behaviors, in forms of discrimination. So what we're trying to suggest is that everyday psychology underpins the wider forms of behavior that we deplore as caste discrimination and casteism, if that makes sense.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that answer. Thank you so much. Well understood.
Yeah, please.
Hi, Professor Gorringe. I am Arvind Kumar, and I am lecturer in Royal Holloway, University of London. My question is about practice of caste in everyday life. Like in my study, like I have looked into the increasing use of caste-specific surnames in India. I do study electoral politics and have looked into that aspect. But when we see like practice, there is growing practice of caste, but issue is that how can we like capture everyday practice of caste? One way it has been suggested now, discussion you presented in your presentation, that experience as important category, and there is quite a lot of discussion on experience, particularly with Professor Gopal Guru's intervention. But when there is like interaction between two different marginalized communities, then how can we know that experience which has been presented by one particular author is like authentic experience or true experience? For example, like in Dalit study, there is extensive focus on autobiographies, which talks about injustice and other part. But one autobiography I would not point out, but when few scholars went back in the village and tried to find out whether author was telling truth or not. So one particular crucial point they found that which was related to the women, it was found to be false actually. So how can we with this experience, we can be sure that whatever has been told or whatever we are listening, that is true actually. It could be strategy of like person, if someone is saying that this has happened or that has happened, it could be strategy also to overcome something or to gain something, even sympathy.
It is methodological question. Yeah.
Yeah, no, and that's always the case. I mean, in any social research, how do you know whether your respondents are telling you the truth or not? I mean, one thing I would question is the idea that there is an authentic experience. Everybody has different experiences, and you know, they are authentic to them. How can we know whether they're telling the truth? Well, it sounds from the examples you've given that something in the account didn't chime true, which is why people have followed it up and asked further questions. In my own work, it tends to be sort of long-term ethnographic research, such that, you know, I am not just sort of dipping in, asking people questions and moving away. I'm trying to get a sense of not only what people tell me, but how they behave and how they interact with others as well. And in fact, some of my work has pointed to discrepancies between, you know, the stated account and the everyday practices. And so, I mean, as a dyed-in-the-wool ethnographer, I would suggest that we should all do ethnography, but clearly that's unrealistic. But you know, the triangulation, data triangulation, you know, it's not taking any given account as more than just an account and mapping it onto other accounts, other forms of data in order to make sure that you're getting as clear and reliable a version of events as you can. I mean, so that would be the case in any research rather than necessarily just in this one. So as Dhaneswar says, you know, it's a methodological issue rather than, I think, one specific to caste.
Yeah, so I'll jump on this question. Like very wonderfully you asked this question, but this is not exactly how we can find the reliability or validity in quantitative study, but in qualitative study, so it is depend upon the research ethics or how it is like relate to your morality or your integrity of research. So if you go back the historical evidences of any research, so we cannot go past, but still we believe there are some evidences, but I cannot comment on popular writing, which is based on autobiography or writing that kind of things. But I can assure you, if you have done something through your PhD, MPhil, or any kind of research which is institutional, that is the best evidence or example through which we can check. Nowadays, there are publishers, they're asking, what is your evaluator's comments when you are sending your book proposal to them. They will not accept your book proposal without the comments of your external examiners. So there are some publishers like Oxford and all, I'm not sure about others and all. But I think this is the evident, and this is the proof. So we don't need to go to the belief and voluntary experiences. I don't think in popular writing we need to go then there is waste of time, because they should do, because in a society, some people will do their ethical work, some people will do integrity in their research, some people will do justice to the research, but few people will get a shortcut way. But for them, so I think So this is a research question. So like a research methodological question, we can get that side. I think I answered the question.
And I guess, sorry, just another thing to add into that makes, I mean, so in the context of work on race, you have, an increasing body of work on microaggressions, and people in the British media will go, "What is this? It's a nonsense." How do we know what people are really feeling? But the whole point is we can't, because we are in a position of privilege where we have to take ourselves out of our everyday, sense of being in order to understand the feelings, the experiences, the day-to-day humiliations encountered by those at the receiving end of structures of inequality. And again, if it's just one person saying that, then you might think, I don't know, but it's not. There are numerous accounts which back up the sorts of stories we present in the book, the sorts of accounts of routine and endemic humiliation at the receiving ends of caste. So that gives one confidence that these accounts are a mirror of reality rather than a figment of the imagination.
I think also just in a kind of broader sense, this is a methodological issue about whether quantitative methods are the best, right? And we know quantitative methods are hugely manipulated as well. And I think this idea around the Sewell report recently, a few years ago, that there is no such thing as institutional racism in the police in this country was hugely problematic given all the evidence we have. And then when it actually comes to bear, it becomes this few bad apples rather than being institutionally. So I think it's a question of when you talk to people in groups in these urban, I work on urban issues in urban areas. And when people say things, other people correct them. So you can't just say what you want to say and it gets away with it. So I think there's a lot of benefit in focus groups, for example, not call them focus groups, but in doing research in India, it automatically becomes a focus group, whether you like it or not. So, yeah.
Follow-up question. Yeah, Professor, recently, again, my point is about capturing. I am not denying that experience or humiliation should not be studied, or I still think that is best way of capturing caste and untouchability. But my larger issue is how to capture those aspects. One way, Dalit studies have extensively argued that autobiography, including Gopal Guru, that autobiography is one of the best way. There I pointed out problem. A second is ethnographic studies, and while recently reading one of ethnographic studies which was done by one of professors here in London University, one institute, and it was done in my area itself. And so that's, since it is done in my area, I am very well aware about the social movements which has happened in last 20 years. And I found that professor has hired two assistants. One used to be upper caste from Western Uttar Pradesh. I know that person very well. Another person from Bengal, and one can imagine that person would not have proper linguistic understanding of Eastern Uttar Pradesh, where that study was done. And one crucial aspect, probably whole social movement, they misread it by just probably in terms of translating the language. So in Eastern Uttar Pradesh in mid-90s, there was movement by Dalits, particularly Chamars and Pasis, that they will not be doing what is called Jajmani system. In that particular one aspect was that they have to take out cow dung or animal dungs, and they were refusing that. It was an act, but probably in order to become sober, they translated it as a manure, and the researcher who was doing research, he translated into night soil. So So original idea, like disgust and humiliation, which is associated with picking out animal dung, that was completely like lost, and it went on to research, went on discussing about changing land relation on labor relation. So this kind of danger, like towards which I am pointing out. Yeah.
So can we take, yeah. Then
Yes.
Yeah.
Myself, Dr. Shrikant Borkar, I teach at Royal Olive as well. And my question to both of you, being an expert of the caste, that after hearing all your presentation and read books written by researchers like you, as we all know, the caste is culturally, historically, socially so deeply entrenched. Given that, if you understand it from that point of view, there any there, do you think that there should be some moral informal framework or accountability towards the researchers, those who belong to the dominant caste, that when they talk about the caste and the ills of the caste, that in their personal lives and their social lives, they should be hold accountable, that how far they are not activist type of work, but how far they're active in their day-to-day life to dismantle this caste, which is antisocial institution. Is there any framework, or should there be any framework, or any anecdotal incidences you might have come across wherein this dominant caste researchers have paved some new way to dismantle the caste?
I mean, I guess what we've seen in the past decade is the emergence of a call for critical caste studies, influenced by work on race in the US, which places these uncomfortable ethical and moral questions at the heart of research on caste, and raises precisely those questions, requires researchers, particularly those working on lower castes, if they don't come from those communities themselves, to think about their relationship to the field, and yes, to hold themselves accountable. So I think we are seeing increasing calls to that end, and I think those are important and welcome. And the days of elite academics leaving the ivory tower to profit off, their work on the marginalized, they ought to be gone, and they certainly ought to be challenged. So yes, and I'm not absolving myself here. I'm putting myself in the firing line here as well, and that is something that I've always tried to reflect on. So in the sections on positionality, reflexivity, ethics, then part of my ethics is always the ethics to the respondents, and I think that is something we need to address. So yes, thanks for the question.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm just replying your question. So when we think how the positionality concept come here, so there are flooded of studies which is on caste or caste issues by the caste, and this is the space where now few Dalits are jumping into this domain, claiming their space in terms of lived experience or self-experience. But I think when we talk about career and institutions, they are well identified, and even the theory on the basis of their fact or the data they have. But when it comes to the practical aspect of their life, so I'm not sure how much they are engaged or involved to eradicate the caste. And in a conscious or subconscious mind, we all reproduce our culture in the sense those who are coming from upper caste, they reproduce their culture in society as well as academic space. Similarly, the Dalits also unconsciously or consciously, they also reproduce their culture. Suppose I'm a low caste, so someone from caste. So consciously or unconsciously, I will let go down or bury my head or more like to them if you consider Gopal's work. His work, when we can get more self-experience related things, but those who work on caste as their major domain, so in one forum I was attracting, so what is the suggestion? They just say to work on problems, so I don't have any stand. So just working on the problem from a dominant perspective and reflecting from a dominated perspective, your experience and ambition and hope to do something to make some changes. And if we see all those who represent this space from the marginal background, they have consciously or unconsciously have an aim to change their space as well as change their surrounding. But I can say on behalf of others, if any of those who are studying on the link, if they can say any few comments how they are more loyal or ethical to change the space for marginality. So thank you.
It's an interesting question. I'll come to you then. I'll come to you. In the sense that if you look at disability studies are now producing ideas around not simply lived experience, but saying the expertise of disabled people is also important. It's not simply the experience. It's as if they don't have expertise. And they have expertise. And then if you think about how there are hidden disabilities versus disabilities that are not so hidden, again, you have different groups. So I think we also have to be careful of not treating these groups as homogeneous groups, even within Dalits and within Brahmin groups.
Yeah.
There are heterogeneous groups as well, and to see how those play out. Let me take a question from you and I'll come to the gentleman.
Firstly, I would like to thank you for this interesting discussion. My introduction, I am Sunil and I am a criminal justice policy student at the LSE. And I am interested in studying about informal social control. So my question to you is, how and till what extent do you think that these everyday caste practices that you mentioned about play a role in how people exercise informal social control within the members of the lower caste? So I'm discussing like not the control that people from the upper caste exercise on the people from the lower caste, but I'm talking about an internal informal social control.
Yeah.
To what extent do you think these practices affect that?
Yeah, I don't, thank you very much for a wonderful question. So what I can say, when it is internal, so the caste barrier automatically removed, because when it's internal, it is a general competition. As in a society, when we want to get some opportunity, something, so there is a general competition, general bias to get or grab the opportunity. But when the caste is coming as a code, so in that place, in case of atrocity cannot be happen within the same community. Similarly, a caste bias or caste discriminations cannot be happen within internal community. Though there are some hierarchy within themselves, but majority, if you talk about informal gathering or informal way of interaction, so caste automatically removed, because this is a separate context. This is, even if there's some problem, this is coming to a general norm of opportunity, get access to things. There is a computational way. So caste is not coming as a code. I think it answered the question.
So just to add on to that, I mean, I think informal social control is central to the reproduction of caste through processes of shaming, through processes of celebrating. And I mean, you know, this is not confined to members of the lower caste. You know, that chapter, "Do not talk like the other caste," shows how that informal social control occurs in all jatis, where, you know, where people are basically reminding their fellows what they should and should not be doing. You know, don't eat with that person, don't accept water from them, don't, you know, go down those streets. Yeah.
Sorry, don't mix with the Dalit students, don't mix with Dalit children.
But also conversely, you know, Dalit, within Dalit caste, people saying, don't cross that line, don't antagonize, don't go into those fields, you know, for fear of inviting retribution against others. And then, you know, my own work focuses on anti-caste Dalit activists, and the number of them who have been scolded, been reprimanded, been chastised by their families because their families feared that their actions would, you know, rebound upon the community as a whole. So that informal social control is absolutely fundamental.
I think if you take the idea of Foucauldian idea of disciplinary power, right? The idea of disciplinary power is to discipline individuals by example, right? So you do it by example, and then the self-disciplining automatically starts embedding itself, right? And this is about, it could be about what little elements have been gained and not wanting to lose that. It's to do with how ostracization might work in communities and so on and so forth. I think this is an interesting question from a criminal justice policy is, you know, who should be held accountable for that self-control, you know, for that kind of self-restriction on it. So you had a question.
Yeah, my name is Dr. Mukesh Chauhan. Although I'm from London, I just got back from India. I spent a lot of time with Dr. Ambedkar Society in Baroda, the very place where he was segregated, where he couldn't even get water. Where's Ajira Gaikwad, who gave him the funds to come to LSE. I was there, I'm in touch actively with all of them there, and I'm meeting them regularly, how he was persecuted. But even more important than that, I openly challenge India's entire caste system from a different approach. I left my surgery and I thought, I went in search of the creator of the universe and the thing which Einstein has searched for. And the important point I want to mention here is caste problem is endemic in India. It won't resolve as long as we have religion and temples and Brahmins. The problem is not going to go away high in the lower caste system. So I approach it from Einstein's point of view, which is that if the thinking which created the problem cannot be solved with the same thinking, you need a different kind of thinking, higher level of thinking. And so I've discovered highest type of knowledge in which I'm challenging actively and routinely, and there are lots of videos on social media I'm putting out in India, and they're actively being censored as well all the time, which is I've challenged the Brahmins Vedas knowledge, I've challenged their Manusmriti knowledge, because I also have made numerous temples in India. Now I don't attend any temples at all. When I found out that none of the Brahmins are worshipping God, they're worshipping deities, but God is at a higher level than deities, and I got scientific proof of that. And even more important, above God is the creator. And I got scientific proof of that as well. In 2020 in India, I was nominated for Nobel Prize, both in medicine and physics. So what I'm saying to you is the caste system would disappear if some of the new discoveries which I've made, which is quantum science, the mind, the consciousness, that every human being is made equal in the image. And that consciousness knowledge, if it comes out, and education is the key. Now, the Dalits are actively being eroded away from the knowledge in the colleges. It's actively everything being privatized. And it's literally the rich versus the poor is prevalent even now, everywhere. So what I'm saying to you is the caste system will not disappear as long until unless you challenge, and I challenge routinely, the Brahmins' knowledge, of superiority, and they talk about purity. And I say about purity is truth, and about truth is absolute truth. And I talk about the scientific discoveries and the proof which I have got and have made. And routinely I encounter this right down all the way through the entire hierarchy. And then people listen because you have a superior knowledge and they can't fight against you. And that's the only way. Education is the key, but deeper scientific quantum knowledge, which I've discovered, is the answer, but it's not going to come overnight because the Dalits are prevented from getting the key thing which they need, which is education.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I'm just looking at the time as well, so you had a question.
My name's Floyd Manderson. I'm an academic team lead at the London School of Science and Technology. My question was, I suppose, if you look at hybrid casteism, which is that say practiced in places such as Trinidad, where you have people that initially were indentured labourers and they were seen as disposable from India. And yet they have then gone on to actually reproduce casteism in a very different form because they felt they actually had a lower form of people, in their view, at that time, which were the slaves. And I wondered if it's something which perhaps as a model taken out of context, i.e. from India as casteism, which people say is there, and then move it to a totally isolated environment, Trinidad in the Caribbean, and see how it's reformed itself to do exactly the same as it did in its host historically. And I think this is something which, frankly, you see repeated. And it's interesting that Dr. Bhoj's thought about how it's sat within education. I wondered if it was something that's explored within the University of the West Indies, for instance, where that's throughout the islands, Guyana, Jamaica, and others, because they all have aspects of indentured labor.
Thank you for picking that up, because in the whole discussion around decolonization and the emphasis on slavery, and they leave out this 100-year period of indentured labor and how that acted. I don't know if
This question online.
oh, there's a question. There's a question online from Deep Chand. I would like to know how and to what extent do you think social boycott from Dalits could be a strategy for resistance against caste norms? For example, now, despite invitation from upper castes, Dalits do not go to attend social occasion because the Dalits know that they will be served food separately. Can one say it's an art of resistance in terms of James C. Scott's work?
Can I respond first, Hugo?
Sure, go.
Yeah, two questions. I'm just repeating a few times. So coming to first questions, is there any model? So my point is definitely we should work on caste. We must work on caste. And if you see the works of Annihilation of Caste by Ambedkar, where he proposed interdying, intermarriage, and few other things. But now, at this point, caste is traveling, even if it travels to overseas in your explanation, Trinidad, all of this is in UK, US, everywhere. So it is reproduced in different form. So making caste alive or dead, that depends on our mentality, how we want to be the caste to remain. And in this case, so we're just working project where we just proposed a model, but I don't know how far it is feasible. So the theory of reproduction of caste through cultural reproduction. Suppose someone from higher caste, when they represent university schools and all, they just bring a baggage of caste themes, like do not talk like others, do not mix with others. So suppose before the socialization process, if you can gather a residential school where they cannot be attached to their parents, family, and society, maybe it is a tough job, but maybe slowly you can start some experimental psychological group. How maybe it will take time. Suppose you will pick some children, some low-caste children, the children into a place. So they will not know about their location at all. How they behave in the society. Maybe it will take some time. Need some psychological test. Maybe that through that we can just get. Or if we dislocate the social and the knowledge system, again from socialization, is there any gene impact? Even if we capture that one, maybe genetically they will produce dominance. So this is all Hugo and Dichan. So I was also narrating same story, how this is a good form of resistance. If that day me and my brother did not resist or did not boycott, so we do not think that how it's travel, how it's appear. But that resistance make us stronger and bring us here and to fight against our struggle and challenges.
Thank you. Yeah, so just a few responses. Dr. Mukesh, I applaud you. Fantastic work that you're doing. I wish I shared your optimism that, you know, if only people knew better, they would behave differently. And I guess one of the objects of the book is to say that caste is relational, and it's these affective dynamics which explain why caste is present amongst those whose religions don't legitimate it. So amongst Christians, amongst Muslims across the subcontinent, why it travels into the West Indies, you know, even though you don't have the same infrastructural and religious legitimation of caste, it's a form of social relations which is embedded in how people view themselves and view others, and is performed and reperformed on that basis. So, you know, numerous studies have shown that caste travels, and when you have a critical mass of people, it reproduces itself in a different form. So it evolves to fit that context. In terms of Dalit boycotts, Deepchand, yes, I mean, they've been used time and again. The problem, as Dhaneswar says, is that everyday resistance may rebound upon the practitioners, and it may have limited impact. So it makes a point, but unless Dalits are in a position of power in a locality, the fact that they are refusing to attend dinners means that they get one less meal on that particular occasion and don't actually affect anything. In certain cases, they may invite violence from the hosts because their invitation was rejected. And so it's difficult. You know, this is why where instead of an everyday form of resistance, a collective and for mobilization can reap greater benefits. That's where, you know, the Perrierists, you know, having mass interdining, having mass, you know, Ambedkar led marches to tanks which refused to allow Dalits to use them. You know, that is a more assertive way of combating and tackling caste, which perhaps reaps greater dividends. So of course you can have a backlash there as well.
On that note, we have passed our time. So thank you very much to Hugo, Dhaneswar, and to Ritu for organizing.